Welcome back, dear students. We are reading chapter Weathering the Storm in Ersama. So let's read the concluding part of the story. But before that, just a quick recap. We have read that how Prashant he paid a visit to his friend's house in Ersama, which is a small coastal town in Orissa. And in the evening, a superstorm took place. A huge destruction was caused by that storm, and Prashant, along with his friends' family, was stuck at the rooftop of the house because the water was everywhere. The whole town was destroyed. His friend's house was safe because it was a pakka house. The family survived for the next 2 days on the coconut tree which had fallen on the roof. And when the rain stopped and water started receding, Prashant he decided to go back to his village. He was worried about his family. He was worried whether they had survived the storm or not. And as he started his journey, he was in a state of shock to see the carcasses of animal and the dead bodies of men, women, children floating on the water. When he reached the village, he saw his maternal grandmother there. She was happy to find Prashant alive. She rushed with open arms to hug Prashant. Prashant also found his rest of the family members in the shelter which was set up by the Red Cross Society. At the shelter, Prashant was disturbed to see the whole scenario. People were stuck in that grief. They were not able to handle themselves. And Prashant, he took a decision to get a grip over himself, and thus he started to be the leader of the group. He was just 19 years old, and he convinced the elders and some young people there in the camp, and thus they made a delegation. They went to the rich merchant of their area to pressurize that he should part with some amount of rice. They came back successfully, and thus the people in the camp were able to have meal after long 4 days. Then the second thing that he did was cleaning the tent. And there he again gave the task to the youth to clean all the shelter with filth, urine, vomit, which was there. And they also attended the wounded people there, those who were suffering with injuries. Now we will start from here that on the fifth day, a military helicopter flew over the shelter and dropped some food parcels. It then did not return. The youth task force gathered empty utensils from the shelter. Then they deputed the children to lie in the sand left by the waters around the shelter with these utensils on their stomachs to communicate to the passing helicopters that they were hungry. Now, so it was fifth day after the super cyclone, and a military helicopter flew over the shelter and it did drop some food parcel. And after that, it did not return. But these food parcels dropped by the helicopters were not sufficient for the large group of people in the camp. So the youth in the crowd gathered empty utensils. The children were made to lie in the sand with the utensils on their stomachs to indicate to the passing helicopters that they needed food. The message got through, and after that, the helicopter made regular rounds of the shelter, airdropping food and other basic needs. So the message was successfully conveyed, and then the helicopters returned with food and other necessary articles for the crowd at the shelter. Prashant found that a large number of children had been orphaned. Orphan means when a child loses either one or both of the parents to death. So thus a large number of children they had been orphaned there. He brought them together and put up a polythene sheet shelter for them. Women were mobilized to look after them, while the men secured food and materials for the shelter. Mobilized means organized to look after the children. So when he observed that a large number of children they had been orphaned, he then brought the children under one polythene sheet shelter. Then the women they were deployed to look after the children, and the men given the duty to arrange for food for everyone. As the weeks passed, Prashant was quick to recognize that the women and children, they were sinking deeper and deeper in their grief. So Prashant, he saw that the sadness of the children and women in the shelter was growing with each passing day. And thus, he persuaded the women to start working in the Food for Work program started by an NGO. And for the children, he organized sports events. He himself loved to play cricket, and so he organized cricket matches for children. So, this Prashant, when he observed the condition of the children and the women there, he requested that the women they should work for the NGO called Food for Work in order to keep the women busy. And in order to keep the children busy, he organized sports events. He took help of the other volunteers also. So Prashant engaged with other volunteers in helping the widows and children to pick up the broken pieces of their life. Pick up the broken pieces means so that they can overcome from the grief. He himself was also involved in all these activities, so he also gathered some of the volunteers means the people who willingly come for the help of others. Thus, with the help of the volunteers, he took care of those widows and orphans so that they can return to the normal life. They can actually pick up the broken pieces of their lives. This means that returning to their normal lives. The initial government plan was to set up institutions for orphans and widows. The government came with the plan that these children, the orphan children, they should be put into orphanage and the widows in some other institutions so that it will be beneficial for them. However, this step was successfully resisted as it was felt that in such institutions, children would grow up without love and widows would suffer from stigma and loneliness. Stigma refers to a disgraceful life. They would still live in the deep grief, they would not be able to overcome their grief. So, thus, Prashant he observed that the government plan would not work because it will not help in overcoming the grief, and thus the children they would suffer from, they would grow without love, and the widow they would suffer the stigma of loneliness. And thus, he decided that Prashant's group believed orphans should be resettled in their own community itself, possibly in new foster families made up of childless widows and children without adult care. Foster families कहते हैं a family that is given the custody or guardianship for children whose parents are dead or unable to look after them. So they legally become the guardian of that children. So thus, Prashant and the other group members, they believe that they should be resettled in the same community with foster families, and thus it will be made up of childless widows and children without adult care. In It is 6 months after the devastation of the super cyclone, and this time Prashant's wounded spirit has healed simply because he had no time to bother about his own pain. So, after the 6 months of the devastation, what we see, Prashant has also come out of the grief of losing his near and dear ones because he was engrossed in helping others that he forgot his own pain, the shock that he had experienced. He was able to forget all those pains because he had involved himself in all these activities. And thus, his handsome, youthful face is what the widows and orphan children of his village seek out most in their darkest hours of grief. So all the widows and orphans, they looked up for him in their time of grief. And so he learned to come out of his gloom and smile in his life. Thus, we see that how a young boy with a with sheer determination decided to become the leader, and he stepped into this and worked in a determined way to help these people who were suffering from loss of losing their near and dear ones, loss of losing their house and losing everything in their life. And he came up as a leader and successfully helped everyone. So, this is all about the chapter Weathering the Storm in Ersama. So, we see that Prashant is the most impressive character in this story. He is full of human feelings and he is caught up in an unexpected situation. He was trapped in this crisis, but he brings out the best qualities in him. When he is forced to seek shelter on the roof of his friend's house, he at that time also thinks of his own village. And when he reaches his village, he assesses the situation, he understands the situation, and thus he acts as a leader. He, along with other volunteers, clears the area of the dead bodies of the people and animals. His heart weeps to see the tragedy all around. And thus, he possesses great leadership qualities because he was able to convince the merchant. He was able to gather people for this sake. He also helped in suggesting how they should actually pass the message to the helicopter so that they can get food at regular intervals. He knew how to meet the challenging situation. And thus, we see he acted as a savior, and he was also admired by all. People looked up to him whenever they felt that they were in grief, whenever they needed. Only Prashant's face was in front of them, and he also selflessly acted as a hero there. So we see that how this chapter brings out the theme that we cannot do anything to prevent or stop natural calamities. Yes, but one thing is clear, that we can make collective efforts to withstand the wrath of such calamity. No one individually can do anything, but we have to put in our best efforts to lessen the pains and griefs caused by the devastation. We should not lose our head when we are trapped in a critical situation. This chapter teaches us that we should put our best efforts, and the result will be there that our sorrows will be halved. When we share grief with others, when we share others' sorrow, we try to lessen others' sorrow, we also feel better. Our sorrow also becomes half. So we should think of helping others. We should not lose our calm in the minds in the times of disasters, and try to do best possible efforts to tackle with the situation. So, dear students, this is all about the chapter Weathering the Storm in Ersama. Thank you, students.